It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, my name is Tyler Hapney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your host and game master, Tyler Hapney. I have game mastered hundreds of sessions of Cyberpunk Red and Dungeons and Dragons, and this podcast is a way for me to reconcile my thoughts on both of those systems. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Cyberpunk Red. Today, we're going to be stepping back from our series on the various roles. We're also not going to be talking about any of this month's DLC. That's right, we are actually going to be talking about some of the deeper parts of Cyberpunk Red lore. In particular, I want to go over some things that, particular one company that has been mentioned many, many times, and if you are a fan of Cyberpunk lore, are probably very well aware of them. But this is, of course, necessary in order to understand Cyberpunk lore, and that is today we're going to be talking about Arasaka, which, spoiler alert, is also going to be our metaphorical monster of the week, so I'll get to that later. Or I guess with Saburo, Arasaka will be our metaphorical monster. But anyways, what is Arasaka? Arasaka is, you could consider it one of the most powerful megacorporations, if not the most powerful megacorporation in the cyberpunk setting. It is a Japanese mega corporation that specializes in arms manufacturing, private security, all sorts of tech. They've managed to get a lot of subsidiaries and built a whole lot of things. But basically, they are, in a way, the main competitor with the American company Militech, which does specialize in private security and weapons manufacturing. What a shocker. I mentioned him earlier, but Arasaka is owned and operated. It wasn't created, I don't believe, but it's owned and CEO'd over by Saburo Arasaka, which is essentially the closest you're going to get to Cyberpunk's big bad evil guy. He really is the driving force behind a lot of what happens in early 2020 lore, and a lot of 2077. Even if he mostly just kind of haunts the narrative in 2077, it's a lot less direct impact over everything. Even though technically he's the one that kind of starts everything, but we'll get into that later when we get into the 2077 section of everything, because I do want to cover that. But primarily, today we are going to be discussing the rise, and I guess you can consider it sort of a fall of Arasaka. So, for one, Arasaka, huge mega corporation in Japan, started in World War II making weapons for the Japanese Imperial Army, which in real life, there is actually, I believe, a Japanese weapon manufacturing company called Arasaka, but it's spelled differently. Either way, Saburo Arasaka was sort of a member of the Arasaka family, and he was in World War II. That's right. This guy is very old, over 100 years, easily. And he was a kamikaze pilot. And things didn't work out too well for him. He didn't wind up actually dying, I believe, during a kamikaze run. And he wound up basically being discharged, and through a series of events, wound up in the head of the Arasaka company, which is in his family and stuff like that. So he is now in charge of the Arasaka company, and at that point, I think a lot of our current sort of modern day history, it does sort of continue as expected. I mean, into the 80s and the 90s. But during that time, Arasaka is a company that is rising in popularity and prominence. So essentially, they've just built up to being a reliable, trusty weapons manufacturer with quite a lot of wealth and money. And hey, here comes Arasaka, and basically taking over quite a lot of different aspects of the Japanese business culture. to the point where they represent one of the bigger corporations in the entirety of Japan. In fact, they might be the most powerful corporation in all of Japan, kind of like Nintendo nowadays, or, all those other Sony stuff like that. Um, but Arasaka, from there, began to develop a sort of interest in the, at the time, Coronado city, which was Richard Knight's attempt to create a basically libertarian utopia for the corporations. And so they started getting involved with that. And well, I think we've already kind of gone over this story, but Richard Knight gets killed by the mafia, and the city is renamed Night City in his honor. And after that, the mob and a lot of other gangs just kind of start going rampant through Night City. So Arasaka are the ones who go in and basically send in units and military forces, security forces, to fight the mafia and all these different gangs that are Verizon and Night City. And that is, I think, one of the core parts of Cyberpunk 2013, which is that first edition of Cyberpunk. Physical edition's very hard to come by or get your hands on. I don't necessarily know about PDF versions. I think I've seen a few floating around. But what is important is that for that first edition of Cyberpunk, Arasaka were actively fighting against the mob, and there's conflict in the streets between the mob I guess it was the Italian mob specifically, and Arasaka. So after that happens, Arasaka wins. Like, just hand and foot. The Italian mob is not really much of a problem in Night City, even by like 2077. Like they're just not really there much anymore. In my personal campaign, I've had to make a couple of resurgences, but nothing like to the extent that they were in 2013 in that first edition of Cyberpunk. But after they've won, Arasaka basically maintains quite a lot of control over Night City from that point on, because of all the stuff they did during that Mafia War. And that is where Cyberpunk 2020 comes in, where Arasaka really are kind of stepping up as the big bad guys of Night City, because they have so much influence and power and all this other stuff that has made them a real force to be reckoned with in Night City. They have positions of power over the city council, over the police. Arasaka can really do just about whatever they want in Night City, and typically the government, the police, anything will back them because it's Arasaka, and they are the most powerful corporation in Night City. So that is sort of where we are at 2020. And that is, of course, before the Fourth Corporate War, which I believe we've did an entire episode discussing. So we're going to kind of go through it here. There's two companies in the ocean, OTEC and Sino. They were basically competing in a way, one of them trying to essentially take over the other. It works both ways, vice versa. And one of them, I forget if it was specifically OTEC or Sino, hired Arasaka as its security company, and the other one hired, I believe it was Sino hired Arasaka, and OTEC hired Militech. So this conflict started between Militech and Arasaka. Both companies already did not like each other very much, and were looking for excuses to test out some of their new products. And turns out a corporate war was the perfect opportunity. So this conflict quickly deteriorated. It became no longer about OTEC versus Sino. In fact, at some point, both of them pulled out of the conflict and were requesting Arasaka and Militech to also pull out, but both of those mega corporations, since they hated the other one so much, said no. So the Fourth Corporate War swiftly turned from OTEC and Sino into a hot war between Arasaka and Militech, which take place over many different cities. It destroyed many different cities, like Chicago was completely leveled by an orbital strike, I believe. It's like, I think Rio de Janeiro, there's some other cities flooded, destroyed, infected with a plague, all sorts of things, all sorts of terrible, terrible things happened during the Fourth Corporate War. At one point, Arasaka or Militech tries to capture the High Riders or take them over, and they're a faction of people who live in space and have never seen Earth, and the High Riders basically take over the Arasaka station and threaten to start blowing things up if they aren't left alone. So the Fourth Corporate War goes crazy. But one of the main drivers behind the Fourth Corporate War was something Arasaka did, and that was create a funny, nifty little program called Soul Killer. Now, if you've played 2077, obviously the name Soul Killer rings in your head pretty easily. But Soul Killer, for those who don't know, is essentially a virus of sorts. And in the cyberpunk world, remember, it's more like the Matrix than it is the actual internet. But it's a virus that can upload itself into someone's consciousness, killing them, but at the same time downloading their consciousness into basically a soul prison that Arasaka owns called Mikoshi. So they started using this on Militech executives and people who are popular or important to the Militech plans, and that really boosted everything into action. And that's where we got that hot war from, is because once Soul Killer came onto the scene, it became extremely obvious that the only way that Militech or anyone could get out of that conflict is if they completely obliterate Mikoshi and Soul Killer and all that other stuff. So that is ultimately where the decision from Militech came to nuke Arasaka in Night City. They were going specifically after Soul Killer and Mikoshi, and well, I mean, that's kind of what they did. Obviously, Mikoshi and all that has been rebuilt by the 2077 or 2070s, but during 2023, when that bomb dropped, that was ultimately a lot of the I guess sort of the basis for that action. Now, what is Arasaka up to today? By the 2070s, well, they've recovered. They've rebuilt an entirely new section of Night City, and that is because of the Unification War. The Unification War is something that happens in the 2060s, where the American president at the time, Elizabeth Kress, was attempting to restore the new United States of America to its former glory, because as of in Cyberpunk universe, the whole United States has been split up into many different sort of mini nations. And this Unification War was an attempt to fix that. Did not work. Did not work at all. And when they got to Night City, they were causing a lot of problems. So the Night City Council went to Arasaka and basically begged them for help. So Arasaka, in retaliation for what Militech was essentially doing to Night City, sends in a huge airship, not airship, like a carrier, for planes and other things. And they show up in the port of Night City, and immediately that basically just sends Arasaka, Militech leaving. They don't want another conflict. And Arasaka, since then, has essentially become the de facto leaders in most influential corporation in Night City yet again. And that is because, of course, the actual city of Night City has laid down and given them basically all that power in exchange for freeing them or getting them out of the Unification War. So by 2077, by the video game, that's why Arasaka is back in Night City and in such a huge capacity. In fact, it seems like a lot of the rebuilding efforts that were made, the reconstruction of Night City does seem to be funded, at least in part, by Arasaka themselves. So yes, they are one of the most important companies in the cyberpunk fiction. And I mean, in terms of the types of things they've done, they are pretty much unequivocally evil. One thing to remember is Saburo Arasaka was a member of the Imperial Japanese Fighting Forces, and he believed in his cause so strongly that he became a kamikaze pilot, which means he still feels pretty deeply a lot of those sort of roots that were taught during, that time. So to understand Saburo Arasaka is you do have to kind of get into the mindset of, what sort of things were kind of being taught at Imperial Japan. And well, a lot of those feelings he probably still holds. In fact, it's been all but confirmed that Saburo pretty much hates anything American. just in general, just because of those old ties. So when it comes to Militech and things like that, and Militech being a competitor with Arasaka, that is something that does not make Saburo Arasaka very happy. So speaking of Saburo, I think we should get into our metaphorical monster of the week, which is, of course, Saburo Arasaka. So we've already kind of talked a bit about Saburo's past, but I want to talk more about his context when it comes to 2077, because he serves as one of the most important characters in that game, despite really only being in it for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 5 to 10. But yes. Spoiler alert for Cyberpunk 2077 for anyone who has not played the game. This is a major plot point that I'm going to be discussing, so this is your warning. Yes, here we go. So, during the story of 2077, we see Saburo Arasaka get killed by his son Yorinobu pretty early on into the story. In fact, that is itself basically the inciting incident. I mean, yes, we were on a heist to steal the relic, but if you consider that the relic was one created specifically for Saburo Arasaka's death, and two, that he died right in front of us, and if he hadn't died, we probably would have gotten away with the heist, then yes, Saburo Arasaka very much is the inciting incident of Cyberpunk 2077. Nothing would have happened if Saburo Arasaka had lived through that beating. So, uh, well, let's talk a bit about that. So, when I mentioned that the relic was specifically built for Saburo Arasaka, some people might not understand that that relic, despite the fact that there was sort of an advertisement and V had recognized it, that specific relic was, I don't think, ever specifically meant to be for public consumption. In fact, we actually, during the devil ending, where Yorinobu is soul killed, and we see Saburo implanted into his body via that same chip that we stole. We see the exact plan of what was meant to happen, of basically Saburo keeping Yorinobu around as essentially a spare body. More than anything, considering he didn't really like Yorinobu. What we know of Yorinobu's history indicates that he's had a lot of problems with his family in the past, and now in 2077 we see him different, maybe a bit more subdued. In 2020, there's even when you're going through Mikoshi in the 2023 Arasaka Tower bombing mission, there's even a moment where you see Yorinobu himself has been soul killed and is kept in Mikoshi, but we don't know exactly if that is, I guess, strictly canon or not. Obviously, I mean, considering everything we know and the fact that Yorinobu used to detest his father, but now by 2077, I mean, he still hates his father, but he's at least participating in the family business, which is different from how 2020 Yorinobu would be. Well, it raises some questions. But basically, yes, that was the plan. Was Yorinobu was basically just a way for Saburo to extend his own life via the relic, the chip that Johnny Silverhand was placed on. I imagine they probably were just keeping Johnny there as a humiliation tactic, or maybe they just, I don't know, maybe they just had him there and were planning on deleting him. That's one part I still kind of figuring out personally. The Johnny Silverhand situation is crazy anyway, because what we see in 2077 isn't even how it actually happened. It was more Spider Murphy that actually put Soul Killer into Johnny Silverhand than anything Arasaka really did. So at the end of the day, there's still kind of, I guess, some fogginess around what exactly went on with Johnny Silverhand and how all of that wound up within Arasaka's hands. There's some assumption that maybe they found Johnny's body in the wreckage and figured, they found his soul killed, whatever. But even then, it's just, I don't know. There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered when it comes to how everything kind of happens in 2077. But in terms of important characters and, of course, our metaphorical monster of the week, Saburo Arasaka, I think, fits perfectly into the description of somebody who could be considered very reasonably a monster. And just to add some little fresh sort of cherry onto the cake, when Saburo found out that Yorinobu was intending to sell the relic for quite a lot of money, he flew to Night City himself, and in a sort of text log, a data log we find that he was having a conversation with Hanako, where he was basically considering just nuking and leveling Night City entirely, just to prevent the relic from getting into the wrong hands. So yeah, he's willing to do some pretty crazy stuff, and he does not care at all about Night City, America, or anything that is not making Arasaka more money. So that is going to be it for Saburo Arasaka and it for us this week. Thank you so much for listening. Please come back and listen next week where we talk a bit more about Dungeons & Dragons. I have been your host, Tyler Hapney. This has been Dungeons & Dystopias. Thank you so much for listening.